At my sister Jessica's engagement party at the prestigious Riverside Country Club, she pulled me aside near the marble fountain and whispered with barely contained disgust, "Alex, please don't mention your weird job tonight. David's parents are here, and they're very traditional." What she didn't know was that the very clinic she was so ashamed of had just received a $1 million federal grant, and I was about to become the youngest director in the program's history. But that revelation would have to wait, because first I had to survive an evening of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Alex Morgan, and I was standing in the gleaming lobby of the Riverside Country Club, adjusting the collar of my borrowed blazer as classical music drifted from the main ballroom. The scent of white lilies and expensive perfume filled the air, a stark contrast to the community health centers where I'd spent most of my adult life. This was my family's world, all polished surfaces and quiet conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in Bend. Tonight, I was the outsider looking in, even though we shared the same last name. The country club stood like a monument to old Portland money, its Tudor-style architecture commanding a view of the Willamette River. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city lights twinkling in the distance, but here inside, it felt like stepping back into the 1950s. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over guests in designer suits and cocktail dresses, their conversations a low hum of comfort and privilege. I smoothed down my simple black pants and tried to ignore the way the hostess had looked at me when I'd given my name at the door, her eyes scanning my outfit with barely concealed judgment. My sister Jessica appeared beside me like a vision in ivory silk, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly to a group of her sorority sisters from University of Oregon. At 26, she was everything our parents had hoped for in a daughter, blonde and polished and engaged to David Thompson, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Portland. She spotted me and her smile faltered for just a moment before she composed herself and walked over. "Alex, you made it," she said, her voice bright but strained. She leaned in for an air kiss that didn't quite connect, her Chanel perfume overwhelming. "I was worried you might not find something appropriate to wear." The words stung with their casual cruelty, a reminder that my teacher's salary at the community health center didn't stretch to the kind of wardrobe that belonged in places like this. Before I could respond, our brother Michael approached with his wife Sarah, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful young couples. Mike worked 80-hour weeks at a corporate law firm downtown, while Sarah ran a pediatric practice in Lake Oswego. They were the golden couple of the Morgan family, living proof that hard work and the right connections could build the perfect life. "There's our little activist," Mike said with a condescending smile, clapping me on the shoulder harder than necessary. "Still trying to save the world one confused teenager at a time?" His words were meant to sound playful, but there was an edge to them that made my jaw tighten. Sarah gave him a warning look, but she didn't correct him. She never did. The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with years of family dinners where my work had been dismissed as a phase, a misguided attempt at rebellion that I'd eventually outgrow. To them, my job as a counselor at the Harmony Gender Health Center wasn't a calling or a career. It was evidence of my own confusion, my inability to understand what really mattered in life. They saw my dedication to helping transgender and non-binary youth as an extension of my own identity struggles, something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. "How's the nonprofit world treating you?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral in the way doctors use when they're trying not to make a diagnosis sound terminal. "Are you still at that place downtown?" She couldn't even say the name of the clinic, as if speaking it aloud might somehow contaminate the conversation. I nodded, choosing my words carefully. The truth was, the Harmony Gender Health Center had become the most respected facility of its kind in the Pacific Northwest. We provided comprehensive care to over 300 families, offered training programs that other states were copying, and had just been selected to pilot a new federal initiative for rural communities. But standing here in my borrowed blazer, surrounded by people who measured success in stock options and country club memberships, those achievements felt invisible. Our parents materialized from the crowd like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Dad looked exactly like what central casting would order for a successful insurance executive. His silver hair perfectly styled, and his Armani suit tailored to hide the softness that came from too many business lunches. Mom was resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her jewelry catching the light as she moved through the room like she owned it. In many ways, she did. Her real estate company had sold homes to half the people in this room. Alexandra, Mom said, using my full name in that particular way that made it sound like a disappointment. She pulled me into a hug that felt more like a performance for the watching crowd than an expression of genuine affection. You look nice, dear. That blazer is very flattering. The compliment felt backhanded, implying that looking nice was an unusual achievement for me. Dad shook my hand with the firm grip he'd taught all his children, but his eyes were already scanning the room for more important conversations. Good to see you, kiddo. Your mother was worried you might not make it. Work keeping you busy? The question was perfunctory, asked more out of social obligation than genuine interest. Very busy, I replied, thinking of the grant proposal I'd submitted just that morning, the one that could expand our services to underserved communities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Communities across Oregon and Washington. We're doing some exciting new programs. I started to elaborate, but Dad's attention had already drifted to a group of men by the bar, their conversation punctuated by hearty laughter and the clink of whiskey glasses. The evening progressed like a carefully choreographed dance, where I never quite learned the steps. I stood at the edge of conversations about ski trips to Whistler and wine tastings in Sonoma, nodding politely while inside I cataloged all the ways this world had rejected me. When distant relatives asked about my work, I gave sanitized answers that wouldn't challenge their comfort zones. When family friends inquired about my personal life, I deflected with questions about their own families, their businesses, their recent renovations. The disconnect was staggering. These people lived in a bubble so complete that they couldn't imagine a world where their children might need the services I provided. They spoke about diversity and inclusion in the abstract, usually in the context of their company's hiring practices or their donations to acceptable charities. But when it came to their own families, their own communities, difference was something to be managed, minimized, or quietly corrected. During dinner, I found myself seated at what was clearly the family overflow table, surrounded by cousins I barely knew, and family friends who remembered me as little Alexandra, but couldn't quite place what I did for work now. The conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to, investments and private schools and vacation properties that existed in a reality completely separate from my own. So Alex, said my cousin's wife, a woman whose name I'd forgotten 30 seconds after being introduced. Jessica mentioned you work with children. Are you a teacher? The question was innocent enough, but it revealed how little my family actually shared about my life with their extended circle. I work in healthcare, I replied carefully. Mental health services for adolescents and young adults. It was true, if incomplete. The Harmony Gender Health Center provided comprehensive care that included medical services, mental health support, family counseling, and community education. But explaining that would require conversations these people weren't ready to have. Oh, how wonderful, she gushed with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for safe, socially acceptable careers. Child psychology is so important. You must see a lot of anxiety and depression these days, with all the social media and pressure. She clearly expected me to agree, to nod along with her conventional wisdom about the challenges facing today's youth. Instead, I found myself thinking about Marcus, a 16-year-old who'd been kicked out of his home for coming out as transgender, who'd lived in his car for 3 weeks before finding his way to our clinic. Or Elena, a college freshman whose parents had threatened to cut off her tuition unless she agreed to conversion therapy. These weren't problems that could be solved with limits on screen time or mindfulness apps. These were young people fighting for their right to exist authentically in a world that often saw their very identity as a problem to be fixed. Yes, I said simply, there are a lot of challenges. I couldn't elaborate without risking the fragile peace that my family had constructed around my work. They could tolerate me as long as I stayed in my lane, as long as I didn't force them to confront the reality of what I actually did every day. The evening wore on, and I watched my sister and David receive congratulations and well wishes from a parade of family friends and business associates. Jessica glowed with happiness and champagne, her hand never straying far from David's arm. They looked perfect together, like they'd been cast for the role of successful young couple. David worked in investment banking, Jessica in marketing for a tech company. They had a condo in the Pearl District matching BMWs, and a 5-year plan that included a house in the West Hills and 2 children in private school. It was the life our parents had mapped out for all of us, the path that Mike and Sarah had followed successfully, and that I had abandoned 7 years ago when I'd chosen to pursue social work instead of the business degree Dad had wanted me to get. That decision had created a rift in our family that had never fully healed, a constant undercurrent of disappointment that colored every interaction. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to filter out into the Portland night, Jessica pulled me aside near the club's entrance. The fountain continued its quiet burbling, and through the windows I could see valets bringing cars around for departing guests. My sister's perfect composure had slipped slightly, her smile more forced than it had been earlier. "Alex, I need to ask you something," she said, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "For the wedding, could you maybe not mention what you do for work?" David's family is very conservative, and his grandmother especially. She wouldn't understand. It would just be easier if you said you were a counselor or something general like that. The request hit me like a physical blow, even though part of me had been expecting it all evening. This was my sister, the person who used to build blanket forts with me, and who had cried when I'd helped her through her first heartbreak. Now she was asking me to hide the work that defined me, the career I'd built from nothing, the community I'd found after my family had made it clear there wasn't really room for me in theirs. "Jess," I started, but she cut me off with a gesture that was pure Patricia Morgan, all elegant dismissal and social efficiency. "Please, Alex, this is important to me. I know you think your work matters, but couldn't you just pretend to have a normal job for one day?" For me, the words revealed everything about how she saw me, how the entire family saw me. My work wasn't real work. My life wasn't a real life. My identity was something embarrassing that needed to be managed in polite company. I stood there in my borrowed blazer, surrounded by the marble and crystal of a world that had never had room for people like me, and felt the familiar ache of being fundamentally misunderstood by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But underneath the hurt, something else was building, a quiet determination that had been growing stronger with each dismissive comment, each request to minimize myself, each casual erasure of everything I'd worked to build. "I'll think about it," I said finally, because causing a scene at her engagement party wouldn't change anything. Jessica smiled with relief and gave me another air kiss before floating back to her fiancé and the remnants of their celebration. I collected my jacket from the coat check and walked out into the cool Portland night, the city lights reflecting off the river like scattered diamonds. Behind me, the country club glowed with warmth and privilege, a beacon of the life I'd walked away from 7 years ago. Ahead of me waited my small apartment in the Pearl District, my beat-up Honda Civic, and the early morning shift at a clinic that served kids whose families had often rejected them for being exactly who they were. What my family didn't know, what they couldn't see past their own discomfort and social anxiety, was that I'd found something in that work that all their money and connections couldn't buy. I'd found purpose, community, and a kind of love that didn't come with conditions or requests to hide who I was. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and go back to that world, the one where my work mattered and my identity was celebrated rather than tolerated. But tonight, driving through the empty streets of Portland, with the radio playing softly, and the city settling into sleep around me, I made a decision. I was done shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never designed for me in the first place. I was done apologizing for work that changed lives and for loving people my family found inconvenient to acknowledge. I was done being their disappointment, and I was finally ready to show them exactly what they'd been dismissing all these years. The drive back to my apartment in the Pearl District took me through the heart of downtown Portland, past the late-night coffee shops and food trucks that served the city's night shift workers. My Honda Civic felt like a time machine, carrying me away from the gilded world of the country club and back to the reality I'd built for myself over the past 7 years. The contrast couldn't have been starker. 20 minutes ago, I'd been surrounded by people discussing their children's private school applications and their plans for summer homes in Cannon Beach. Now I was passing the 24-hour diner where many of my clients worked to support themselves after their families had cut them off. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was driving from a celebration of traditional family values toward a neighborhood where I'd helped dozens of young people create their own families after being rejected by the ones they were born into. The Pearl District had transformed over the years from an industrial area into a hub of artists, young professionals, and people who didn't quite fit into Portland's more conventional neighborhoods. It was expensive now, gentrified beyond what most social workers could afford, but I'd managed to hold on to a small studio apartment thanks to rent control and a landlord who appreciated having a stable tenant. I parked in the narrow alley behind my building and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, my borrowed blazer feeling heavier with each step. Inside, my space was a study in efficient living, every square foot carefully utilized. The walls were covered with photos from my work, certificates from training programs, and artwork given to me by clients over the years. A teenager named River had painted a watercolor of a phoenix rising from flames with the words, "Thank you for helping me become myself," written in careful script at the bottom. It hung directly across from my bed, the first thing I saw every morning, and the last thing I saw every night. I hung the blazer carefully in my closet, a reminder of an evening I wanted to forget, but knew I never would. Then I changed into worn jeans and a sweater that actually belonged to me, clothing that felt like coming home to myself after hours of playing dress-up in someone else's life. I made a cup of tea and settled onto my small couch with my laptop, intending to catch up on some case notes, but instead found myself staring at the reflection of my living room in the dark window. The person looking back at me had come a long way from the confused college student who'd first walked into a community center 7 years ago. That younger version of myself had been drowning in expectations, struggling to reconcile the person I was becoming with the person my family needed me to be. I'd been majoring in business administration at Portland State, following the path Dad had laid out, but every class felt like wearing shoes that were the wrong size. I was going through the motions of a life that didn't fit, and everyone around me seemed to notice, except the people whose approval I craved most. It was during my junior year that everything changed, though I didn't recognize it as a turning point at the time. I'd been walking across campus after a particularly soul-crushing accounting class when I noticed a flyer on a bulletin board. The Southeast Portland Community Health Center was looking for volunteers to help with their new youth outreach program. Something about the description caught my attention, the way it talked about serving young people who didn't have access to traditional health care, who were navigating identity and family challenges without support. I'm not sure what possessed me to call the number on the flyer. Maybe it was the feeling that I was slowly disappearing into a major I hated, or maybe it was the growing awareness that I needed to find something that felt meaningful. The woman who answered the phone was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, though I didn't know then that she would become one of the most important mentors in my life. Her voice was warm and direct, and when I explained that I was interested in volunteering, she invited me to come in the following week for an orientation. The Community Health Center occupied a converted warehouse in a part of southeast Portland that gentrification hadn't reached yet. The building was nothing like the sleek medical offices where my family received their health care. The waiting room had mismatched chairs and children's drawings taped to the walls. The air smelled like industrial-strength disinfectant, and the coffee that seemed to be constantly brewing in the staff break room. But there was something else in the atmosphere, something I'd never encountered in all my years of private schools and country club events. There was hope, and there was genuine care, and there was a sense that every person who walked through those doors mattered. Dr. Rodriguez was in her early 40s then, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore scrubs instead of the designer suits I was accustomed to seeing on successful women, but she carried herself with a confidence that commanded respect. During my orientation, she explained that the center served primarily low-income families, many of them immigrants or people who had been failed by the traditional healthcare system. "We see a lot of young people here who are dealing with complex identity issues," she told me as we walked through the clinic's narrow hallways. Kids who don't fit neatly into the categories that most healthcare providers understand. Many of them have been rejected by their families, kicked out of their homes, or forced into situations where they have to choose between being authentic and being safe. The words hit me with unexpected force. I'd never been kicked out of my home or faced the kind of dramatic rejection she was describing, but the feeling of having to choose between authenticity and safety resonated in ways I wasn't ready to examine. My own struggles with identity seemed trivial compared to what these young people were facing, but Dr. Rodriguez seemed to understand something about the universal nature of that particular pain. My first day as a volunteer, I was assigned to help with intake paperwork and basic administrative tasks. I expected to spend my time filing and answering phones, useful but unremarkable work that would look good on my resume and fulfill my service learning requirements. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a 17-year-old named Cameron, who had been living in their car for 2 weeks after coming out as non-binary to parents who insisted it was just a phase that could be cured with enough prayer and discipline. Cameron had arrived at the clinic looking for basic medical care. Their insurance had been canceled when their parents kicked them out, and they'd been rationing insulin while trying to figure out how to navigate the healthcare system alone. As I helped them fill out forms for emergency assistance, they told me about the relief of finally having words for how they'd always felt, and the devastating loneliness of losing their entire support system in the process. The hardest part isn't even being homeless, Cameron said, their voice steady despite the tears in their eyes. It's knowing that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally would rather have a dead child than a trans one. It's realizing that their love was always conditional, that you just never knew what the conditions were until you broke one. I sat in that sterile examination room, surrounded by the mundane tools of healthcare, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't theoretical anymore, wasn't an abstract concept from a sociology textbook. This was a real person, barely younger than me, who had been forced to choose between survival and authenticity. And they had chosen authenticity, even though it had cost them everything they'd previously understood as family. Over the following months, I met dozens of young people with similar stories. There was Marcus, who had been sent to conversion therapy by parents who couldn't accept that their son was gay. There was Jamie, a transgender woman whose family had refused to use her chosen name or pronouns, insisting that acknowledging her identity would be, quote, enabling her delusion. There was River, the artist who had painted the phoenix on my wall, who had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt triggered by years of family rejection and school bullying. Each story was different in its details, but unified in its central tragedy. These were young people who had found the courage to live authentically, and they had been punished for it by the very people who should have protected them. They came to the community health center not just for medical care, but for something even more fundamental. They came looking for adults who would see them as they truly were and love them anyway. Dr. Rodriguez became my guide through this world I'd never known existed. She had started her career as a traditional family therapist, working with middle-class families to resolve conflicts and improve communication. But over time, she'd been drawn to work with marginalized communities, particularly LGBTQ+ youth, who had been failed by systems designed to help them. The traditional family therapy model assumes that families want to stay together, she explained to me one afternoon as we sat in her cluttered office, case files stacked on every available surface. It assumes that with enough communication and compromise, most family conflicts can be resolved. But sometimes, the conflict isn't about misunderstanding or poor communication. Sometimes, the conflict is about fundamental acceptance of who a person is. She showed me statistics that made my stomach turn. LGBTQ+ youth were 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. 40% of homeless youth identified as LGBTQ+, most of them kicked out of their homes after coming out. Transgender youth who didn't have family support had a suicide attempt rate of over 50%. But youth who had just one supportive adult in their lives saw their risk factors drop dramatically. We can't always fix the families, Dr. Rodriguez told me, but we can be that supportive adult. We can create spaces where young people can be themselves without fear, where their identities are celebrated rather than pathologized. We can help them build chosen families that provide the love and support their biological families couldn't give them. The concept of chosen family was revolutionary to someone who had grown up believing that blood relationships were the most important bonds in life. In my world, family loyalty was paramount, even when that loyalty came at the cost of personal happiness or authenticity. The idea that people could create new families based on love and mutual support rather than biological connection challenged everything I'd been taught about how relationships worked. But as I spent more time at the community center, I began to see chosen families in action. I watched older LGBTQ+ adults serve as mentors to younger people who were just beginning their journeys. I saw peer support groups where people who had survived family rejection helped others navigate similar experiences. I witnessed the quiet miracles that happened when isolated young people found communities where they belonged. My own family began to notice the changes in me as I became more involved in the volunteer work. I had always been the compliant child, the one who followed rules and met expectations without complaint. But now I was missing family dinners to attend training sessions. I was asking questions about social justice and healthcare access that made people uncomfortable. I was using vocabulary they didn't understand, and talking about experiences that challenged their worldview. The first real confrontation came during Christmas dinner of my junior year. We were gathered around the dining room table in my parents' Lake Oswego home, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and celebrations. The conversation had turned to local politics, specifically a ballot measure that would have provided funding for mental health services in schools. "I don't understand why we need special programs for every little thing," Mike said, cutting into his prime rib with precision. "When we were kids, if you had problems, you dealt with them. All this coddling isn't helping anyone." "Some kids need more support than others," I said quietly, thinking of Cameron and Marcus and all the other young people I'd met who might have benefited from having a supportive adult in their school. Not everyone has the same advantages or the same family support. Dad looked up from his plate with the expression he wore when he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom. "Alex, that volunteer work you're doing is admirable, but you need to understand that some people create their own problems. If these kids would just focus on their education instead of all this identity nonsense, they'd be better off." The words hit me like cold water. Identity nonsense. As if the fundamental human need to be seen and accepted for who you are was somehow frivolous, a distraction from more important things like grades and career prospects. "It's not nonsense, Dad," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "These are kids who are struggling with basic acceptance from their families. They're not choosing to be different to make their lives harder. They're just trying to be honest about who they are." Mom reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of condescending gentleness she used when she thought I was being naive. "Sweetheart, you have such a good heart. But you need to be careful about getting too involved in other people's problems. These situations are usually more complicated than they appear on the surface." The implication was clear. I was too inexperienced, too sheltered, too naive to understand the real complexities of the situations I was encountering. My family saw my growing passion for social justice work as a phase, a temporary detour from the practical path they'd mapped out for me. They couldn't imagine that what I was learning might be teaching me something valuable about life, about love, about what it meant to build a meaningful existence. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the artifacts of my earlier self, I realized that I was facing a choice similar to the one many of my clients had faced. I could continue on the path my family had chosen for me, pursuing a business degree and eventually a corporate job that would provide financial security and social approval. Or I could follow the calling I'd discovered at the community center, even if it meant disappointing the people whose opinions had always mattered most to me. The decision wasn't immediate or dramatic. It unfolded slowly over the course of my senior year, as I changed my major to social work and applied for positions at nonprofits instead of corporations. Each step felt like walking away from one version of myself and toward another, and each step was met with increasing resistance from my family. The final break came at my college graduation. I'd been accepted to a master's program in clinical social work at Portland State, with a specialization in adolescent mental health and LGBTQ+ issues. I'd also been offered a full-time position at the community health center, working directly with Dr. Rodriguez to expand their youth services. It was everything I'd hoped for, a chance to turn my passion into a career and make a real difference in young people's lives. But when I shared the news with my parents at the graduation dinner, their response was swift and unequivocal. Dad set down his fork and looked at me with the kind of disappointed expression I'd only seen a few times in my life, usually when one of his business deals had fallen through. "Alex, this has gone far enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority he used in boardroom negotiations. "You've had your fun with this volunteer work, but it's time to get serious about your future. I've talked to some people, and there's a position available at my friend's consulting firm. Good salary, excellent benefits, room for advancement. You can start as soon as you finish this social work thing." This social work thing was how he referred to the master's program I'd been planning for months, the career path I'd chosen after careful consideration and extensive research. To him, it was an obstacle to be overcome, a temporary detour from the real business of building a successful life. "I appreciate the offer, Dad, but I've already accepted the position at the community center," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is what I want to do with my life. I'm good at it, and it's important work." The silence that followed felt like the air being sucked out of the room. Mom looked stricken, as if I'd announced a terminal diagnosis. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion that I'd lost my mind. Jessica, who was only 19 at the time, stared at her plate as if she could disappear into it. "Important work?" Dad's voice was rising, drawing attention from other diners in the restaurant. "Alex, you're talking about making $30,000 a year working with troubled kids. How is that going to support you? How are you going to buy a house, start a family, build any kind of security for yourself?" The questions revealed everything about how my family measured worth and success. In their world, a job's value was determined by its salary and social status, not by its impact on human lives. The idea that I might find fulfillment in work that paid less but mattered more was incomprehensible to them. "Not everyone defines success the same way, Dad," I said, feeling years of suppressed frustration finally finding their voice. "Maybe I don't want the same things you want. Maybe making a difference in people's lives is more important to me than having a big house and a prestigious job title." The words hung in the air like an accusation, which in many ways they were. I was rejecting not just their career advice, but their entire value system. I was saying that the life they'd built, the success they'd achieved, wasn't enough for me. I was saying that I wanted something different, something they couldn't understand or provide. Mom reached for her wine glass with shaking hands. "Alex, honey, you're still young. You don't understand how hard life can be when you don't have financial security. These idealistic notions are lovely, but they don't pay the bills or provide for a family." "I understand more than you think I do," I replied, thinking of all the young people I'd met who had been forced to survive on their own, who had figured out how to pay bills and find housing and build lives without any of the advantages my family took for granted. "I've learned a lot from the people I work with about what really matters in life." Dad's expression hardened into the look he wore when business negotiations weren't going his way. "If you're determined to pursue this foolishness, don't expect any financial support from us. We're not going to subsidize a career choice that makes no sense." The ultimatum was delivered with the casual brutality of someone who had never doubted their own power to control other people's lives. He was betting that my fear of financial insecurity would override my commitment to the work I'd grown to love. He was betting that I would choose comfort over conviction, safety over authenticity. "I understand," I said. And I did. I understood that my family's love had always come with conditions, expectations, and requirements that I conform to their vision of success. I understood that choosing my own path would mean losing their approval and support. And I understood that, despite the fear and uncertainty, I was going to choose it anyway. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence, and in the weeks that followed, our relationship settled into a pattern of polite distance that had persisted ever since. They didn't cut me off completely, but they made it clear that my career choice was a source of disappointment and embarrassment. Family gatherings became exercises in avoidance. Conversations carefully steered away from topics that might remind everyone of my choice to work with those people instead of building a real career. 7 years later, sitting in my small apartment after another evening of feeling like a stranger in my own family, I reflected on how that choice had shaped everything that came after. The work had been harder than I'd expected, both emotionally and financially. There had been nights when I'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner, and wondered if my parents had been right about the importance of financial security. There had been cases that broke my heart, young people I couldn't save, families that couldn't be reconciled. But there had also been victories that made every struggle worthwhile. I'd watched Cameron graduate from community college and start their own nonprofit serving homeless LGBTQ+ youth. I'd officiated at Jamie's wedding to a woman who loved her completely and unconditionally. I'd received dozens of letters and emails from former clients who had gone on to build beautiful lives filled with chosen family and meaningful work. Most importantly, I'd found my own chosen family in the community of people who shared my commitment to social justice and human dignity. Dr. Rodriguez had become the mother figure I'd never had, someone who supported my growth without trying to control my choices. My colleagues at the clinic had become siblings who understood my work and celebrated my victories. The young people I served had taught me more about courage and resilience than any business school ever could have. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked again at River's painting of the phoenix rising from flames. Tomorrow, I would wake up and return to work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued authenticity over conformity. My family might never understand or approve of the choices I'd made, but I had built a life that aligned with my values and served something larger than myself. And tomorrow, I would take the next step in a journey that had started 7 years ago in a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, when a confused college student had first encountered the revolutionary idea that love should be unconditional, and that every person deserved to be seen and celebrated for exactly who they were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.